Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the webinar this evening, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef Lamb. My name is Catherine Parrott, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on suckler cow fertility and health post-calving. Our presenter this evening is Joe Henry, who is a beef and sheep farmer and vet. So the plan of action is Joe will take you through a presentation, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, but if anybody would like to ask a question, or if at any time you think of anything, then please type it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and then when Joe is finished presenting, I can ask him those questions. We have over 70 people registered for the webinar this evening, and I'd just like to thank Elena, who is working behind the scenes to keep everything running as smoothly as possible. We have had an initial slight delay between the slides and the audio, so just bear with us if that is happening, but hopefully it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Joe for this evening's webinar.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine. If you just pop the second slide up now. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. So with suckler cows, one of the main ways of trying to increase the profit is by increasing the output. By output, we mean kilos of calf weaned per cow bulled. And you need to have good fertility for that. The reason being that you want to increase the number of calves born, and if you can have a tight calving period, you get more calves born at the start of the calving period, and that's one of the best ways of actually lifting the average weaning weight, which ultimately is what you're paid for, because the weaning weight is the kilos of calf the cow produces. So 1 calf per year per cow is the aim. It's very hard to do that, but hopefully by following everything we're doing tonight, it gives you a really good chance of doing it. Certainly, unfortunately, at the moment with the stock take, we're in the mid-80s in terms of percent calves reared per cow, but I think low 90s is very much achievable. But it doesn't happen by accident. You have to get all your ducks in a line. Right, so a cow's gestation, suckler cow's gestation is around 285 days, and that varies a fair bit from within breeds and between breeds. We'll talk a bit that on later. And on average, and it's very much on average, a cow comes bulling 45 days after calving. So if you add the 45 days to the 285, you can see she's only got about 30 odd days, 35 days in which to conceive, to get a calf born at the same time each year, which is pretty tricky, really. Now that 45 days on average that they come bulling, that's actually affected by loads of different things. So it's how fit she is, her body condition score at the point of calving, whether she's had a rough calving or not, whether she's had retained cleansing, got a bit of metritis. It's what her nutrition is like after calving, and whether she's got any infection, mastitis. The other things that are important are trace elements. In terms of the actual conception, all that above is important, as well as diseases like the BVD and also the bull fertility. So that hopefully sets out the stall of where we want to be and what we're up against, the challenges we're up against. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the condition of the cow at the point of calving sets the time that the cow will come bulling to a very great extent. So if you have a lean cow at the point of calving and then feed her loads afterwards, you won't actually alter the time that she comes bulling very much at all. And because of that, that's why it's so important to get the target body condition score of 2.5 to 3 for the point of calving. And trying to make up lost ground afterwards doesn't really work, and you'll end up with this long period postpartum where they're not come cycling. So because of the target condition score, you've got to feed to condition pretty much the whole winter for spring calving cows. And ideally, they want to be at their target at least a couple of months before actual calving. If you start feeding pretty hard in the last two months or so, because of partition, what tends to happen is it goes into the calf, and you get a big calf pulled out of a thin cow, and it doesn't really go onto her back at all. So that's why it's quite important to get to the target beforehand. And I would always condition to score your cows at mid-pregnancy when they're being PD'd and feed accordingly to help hit that target. Once you're actually bulling the cows, it's important that they're not actually losing weight. They're not on negative energy balance. And ideally, it should be a rising plane of nutrition, much like tupping ewes. Everything's fertility is better if it's well fed. And plenty of times I've been PDing in the autumn and the cows are lean, there's been a drought, and the fertility is poor because of that. And I think it's much better to be a bit more proactive, and if you think there's not enough feed in front of them, supplement as necessary. So that could be in the form of extra forage or concentrates, or if you're an autumn calver and you had your silage analysed, it's not very good, then you need to build in some extra food. Don't just rely on chance. Next slide, please, Catherine. So calving difficulties, they just cause time and hassle and welfare issues, really, and they're best to avoid. Obviously, there's problems for the actual cow, and the calf, but also the unseen thing is that cows that have calving difficulties, that really increases the length of time before they come bulling. It can be 2 to 3 months. So that by that point, they're definitely not going to be able to have a calf every year at the same time. I think a sort of threshold that I think about is about 5% of the cows and 15% of the calves should be helped. And if you're having to help more than that, then I think you really need to look at your systems, because it will be costing you money. It's when you look at empty cows at PDing time, it's worthwhile, as well as looking when they calved, which bull they calved to last time. It's amazing how often a pattern emerges, and some bulls, which lead to more difficult calvings, will actually be dragging down the fertility of the herd, because those cows are taking longer to get back in calf. That's where your records are important. Obviously, in terms of EBVs, we'll be talking about that in the bulls, but they're not perfect, but they're a really good guide to calving values and trying to reduce the size of these calves. And the size of the calf is the major factor for a calving difficulty. Another way you can slightly manipulate the calf size is by reducing the cow's nutrition in that middle third of pregnancy. What that does is it reduces the placenta size, which sort of reduces the eventual size of the calf. And that's one of the reasons why, if you've got the same bull on a spring calving and an autumn calving herd, you can have quite an okay calving with the spring herd, but fairly difficult time with the autumn calvers. And so spring calvers sort of lend themselves to that better control, because that middle third is at the start of the winter. The next reason for calving difficulties after the calf size is the pelvic area size. And we'll talk later on about pelvic measuring heifers and trying to remove breeding animals with small pelvises. The condition score of the heifers is important as well. And if they're too fat, and by too fat I mean 4 or above, then that leads to an increased chance of dystocia. That's not the case with cows. The evidence isn't there. And a lot of people, I think, worry a lot about having cows too fit. Certainly you can have your heifers too fit, but the evidence isn't there for cows. The other problems with the calving difficulties is that it's much higher chance of getting infection into the cow, and that will limit the chance of her conceiving, as well as increasing the time for her to come bulling. And finally, iodine deficiencies can lead to these slow calvers, where cows wander around not really calving, but they should be, and you end up getting a dead calf with infection and things into it. And that leads us on to the next slide, please, Catherine, on trace elements. So I think it's really important to know your status, not just put some ad lib general purpose minerals down and hope they do a good job. Some cows will take too much, some won't take enough. It might not be that you don't need to spend any, but I think it's important to actually identify what you are short of and supplement accordingly. And then I think also to actually check that what you're doing is working, because that can sometimes lead to problems. So, a check to see how it is going with some sampling done after supplementation if it's needed. The main trace elements for fertility are selenium, copper, and iodine. And certainly for calving, I would want to have selenium, which leads to, if you have shortage of that, more cleansing problems and slower calves, and iodine with slower calves. So I think it's quite important to have those sorted for calving, and certainly they need the copper as well for the bulling period. There's a limited store in the cow of selenium, and unfortunately now there's because of that you need to have continuous supplementation. But the long-acting selenium injection has been taken from us from the market, which is really unfortunate. So the only real way of supplementing in terms of every day is a bolus. If you are going to bolus and you need to for your selenium and such like, then a good time to do it is about a month before calving. Probably at the same time as they get a clostridial vaccine or a rotavirus vaccine, because then the calf's born with good levels and the cow has good levels for the actual stress of calving, so the calf should be born pretty footy, but also it's still working for the bulling period, because most of these boluses last 6 months. Obviously, if your calving pattern's all over the shop, then it's difficult for that to work, but hopefully you've got a nice tight 10-week calving pattern and bulling, and so one bolus will do both periods. Lastly, it's very often that the bull is forgotten, but it'll be the ground that's short in any trace elements if there is a deficiency, and then the cows are deficient secondary to the ground, and the bull will be in exactly the same position. So if your cows need to be done, you should do your bull, but I'd make the proviso it needs to be done at least 2 months before he goes to work, because semen takes about 7 weeks from when it's first produced to when it's ready to work, as it were. And so that's why he needs to have it at least 2 months, because the boluses take about 10 days to start working. A good time to do it at the same time as a pre-breeding check, which we'll talk about later. Next slide, please, Catherine. So pre-breeding checks are a useful thing to do on your cows. It's totally commonplace in the dairy industry, much rarer in the beef. I would suggest a good way is to target that those pre-breeding checks, and I would check any of these cows that have either had a bad calving or retained their cleansing, any of those conditions. And I would, when they calve, keep them close at hand for 3 weeks, and then get them back in and do a vaginal examination. Just put a glove on and scoop around in the vagina, and if you get any of that, it should be all clear mucus. If you have any of that porridgey sort of stuff, white porridgey stuff, phone your vet and get her or him to come out and give them a wash out with some Metrocure. I think it's pretty worthwhile doing. A lot of cows that have twins end up being gelled or barren the next year. And a lot of it is the fact that cow that has twins doesn't completely cleanse, and she has a little bit of a placenta left inside, which basically rots and causes a focus of infection, and you get a bit of endometritis with this whites, and that scars the uterus up. And even if it clears itself after a couple of months and she does come bulling, then she's got a much less chance of conceiving because of the scarring in the uterus. So if you're a bit more proactive and treat these infections at that sort of 3-week stage postpartum and get them cleared up, and then check that that has worked, then you've got a much better chance of getting them in calf. One of our farmers that had used to get a lot of sets of twins. When we started doing this, he had 18 sets of twins and he got 16 back in calf, and that's to a 9-week calving pattern. And normally you only got between 1/2 and 2/3. So I think it really can work. So yeah, if this happens at calving time, don't just kick them away to the hill and expect to see them in 6 months. Just put them out and keep them close at hand, and then be a bit proactive and get them checked. Next slide, please, Catherine. For heifer selection, I mean, this is quite a big topic in itself. You've got to think about what age you want to be calving them. If you're spring or autumn calving, then you've really got the choice of either a 2-year-old heifer at calving or a 3-year-old heifer at calving. I think really that's not a choice, and you should go for 2-year-old if you can manage it, and it will take a bit of managing. Some work done in Ireland thinks that that's the single biggest management decision you can make to try and put your suckler herd into profitable standing, is by calving at 2, because you get the extra output. rather than keeping a cow for a full year, or a young cow, and not getting any output to her. So to calve them at 2 would mean bulling them at 15 months. And generally, they're more fertile at 15 months than they are at 27 months. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that they're not too fat. It's quite hard to stop these 27-month-old bulling heifers getting too fat. And if they're too fat, it switches off the reproductive hormone, just like in any animal. If you are bulling them at 15 months, they need to be big enough. And by that, 2/3 of the cow weight. Excuse me. So if your cows are 600 kilos, they need to be 400 kilos. Now, that's not actually too difficult to do, because a lot of people will be weaning calves at 280 to 300 kilos in the November time. So you've got 6 months to put on 100, 120 kilos, which really should be no bother. As regards temperament, there's no calf worth getting injured for. And you know, farming already has a pretty unenviable record on health and safety. And I think rather than that flighty heifer hoping that it calms down as a cow, I will just stick it straight in the fattening pen and not even bother sort of bullying it. From a disease status point of view, you've got to, if you're homebred, you should know your disease status and take precautions. If you're buying in, you really want to know what the disease status is, be that their yoni status, their BVD accredited, what's their TB like. We'll talk a bit more about disease status in the cows later. A good thing to do for heifers is to get their pelvic area measured by the vet. So what that involves, for those that don't know, is the vet comes and puts a set of calipers up the rectum and measures the vertical measurement from basically top to bottom of the pelvic inlet, and then turns the calipers around and gets a horizontal, and then you multiply those two numbers to give a pelvic area. And the Canadians have done a huge amount of work on this, thousands, tens of thousands of heifers, and there's a reference chart. But any given age, the pelvic area needs to be a given size. And for most heifers, they can't comfortably achieve over that pelvic area. But what we tend to find is there's somewhere in the region of 10% outliers with much smaller pelvises. And if you can identify them at this stage before they even go to the bull, and you stick them in the fattening pen, it's going to save all that work and hassle and trauma later on. Because I'm sure we've all gone to calve heifers, heifer that's not getting on with it, put a hand in and felt there's no room and thought, goodness, we're not even going to get hardly a lamb out of here, let alone a calf. And so get rid of those before they cause them problems. For uterus tract scoring for these 15-month-old heifers, a small proportion might not be cycling. And especially if you're going to be using AI, where you want your best chance of getting good conception rates. While the vet's doing the pelvic measuring, it's a good idea to get her or him to do the uterus tract scoring and check their cycling. As I say, if you're putting them with the bull, they might come cycling in the next month or two anyway, and you've maybe not lost anything. But if you're spending 50 quid on synchronizing them and AIing them, I think you want to try and get the best chance you have of getting a good conception rate. I wouldn't be putting any of the score 1s and 2s in. Lastly, think about the maternal EBVs of your heifers. Obviously, any calves they produce are going to be half your bull's genetics as well as half their genetics. So don't just ignore the cow side of things, and hopefully match their EBVs with your breeding goals. But pay particular attention to things like their milk value and such like. Next slide, please, Catherine. So bull factors. As we've discussed, EBVs, all registered bulls have EBVs, whether the farmer himself records it or not. And while they're by no means perfect, they are the best guide we've got. Unfortunately, a lot of bulls at 2 years old at the sales, and you get catalogues like this, are just 40 to 50% accurate. But that's still better than guessing. And it's unlikely a bull goes from a +2 to a -6, say, for calving value. So I think they really should be taking into account. It amazes me how bull catalogues, how many bulls there are in catalogues in the bottom 10% of the breed for calving value. and they're being presented at sales, and you really would have to be very careful with that sort of calving value as to how you'd manage that. Unfortunately, we seem to have selected for growth and muscling very effectively the last 30 odd years, but that actually drags up birth weight and increases calving values in the vast majority of cases, because they are correlated. So I think that's probably why we're getting bigger and bigger calves, and it's beholden to us, I think, to remedy that. So as well as actual calving ease EBVs, there's also gestation length, and I think the gestation length is really critical. Farms that have switched to shorter gestation bulls in the last 10 years have made massive strides in their fertility, and I think a lot of it is due to this short gestation, with some bulls being 10 to 14 days shorter gestation than others. And if you think about that cow that's got 30 odd days to get back in calf from when she comes bulling to when her 365 days is up for calving again, then if you're getting an extra 10 days, then you're actually getting a 25% better chance for her uterus to get prepared to accept another pregnancy. And I think that's what's driving this improvement in fertility. So yeah, I would always go for a short gestation length. Next slide, please, Catherine. So what other factors affect the bull fertility? Well, body condition, just like the cows, you want him onto his target condition. So that's sort of 3 to 3.5, fit, not fat. And certainly hand in hand with that is his nutrition. So if he's come straight from the sale and body condition 5, and he's been in a pen for the last 6 months being hand fed, and you put him out on a hill, expect him to make 30 cows, he's obviously going to be in negative energy balance, and be losing weight and have a decreasing sperm count. So it's always a good idea to try and get bulls before you actually need to use them, and get them settled down and get into a sensible, as I say, fit, not fat, conditional 3 to 3.5. The diseases that you need to be thinking about as bulls is obviously make sure he's not a PI. Make sure also that you know your BVD status, and he's not naive and going to be, because if he catches BVD from your cows, he comes from a high health thing, and he could be infertile for 3 months, which is your entire bulling period. So it's important to try and know your BVD status and put things in place, getting him vaccinated in plenty of time to protect him. And the same goes for the Jonies. Unfortunately, there's no point just testing a new bull at 2-year-old from a sale. What's much more important is to buy from a herd that is one of the cattle health scheme and Yoni's accredited, and they're testing all their cows every year. And that'll give you a much better idea of the Yoni status of the farm and how likely he is to go down the Yonis or spread Yonis potentially to your farm. We've talked about the trace elements, and he shouldn't be forgotten, so make sure you get him bolused in plenty of time. And I think bulls are more prone to parasite problems, whether that's because they're purebred animals or whether because males are just slightly less robust. But make sure your fluke and worm programs are in place and working correctly, and you're not problems with any resistance to the anthelmintics. Because otherwise, if he's got, say, chronic liver fluke, that will certainly bring down his body condition and reduce his fertility. In terms of his locomotion, he needs to be walking well, and I think it's probably a good idea for terminal sire bulls to get their feet trimmed once a year, ideally at least 2 months again before he goes to work, to avoid the new shoes syndrome of, if you could put on a new pair of shoes and then expected to walk up Ben Nevis, you might end up with blisters. So if you get them all trimmed and prepared at least a couple of months beforehand. I think you've got to think, if you've got a bull that's producing heifer, breeding you heifers for you to retain in the herd, that if you have to trim his feet, whether he's the bull for you, because bad feet are moderately heritable, and what you don't want to be doing is breeding poor feet into your herd. So if you're looking to keep daughters of him, then I think that's a selection issue there. Vaccinations, again, they should all be done at least a couple of months for the same reason. If you get, with any vaccination, you can get transient high temperatures or pyrexia. And so if you do that the week before he goes out, give him his jags, you've forgotten about him, and he gets a temperature, and then he could be infertile for the next 2 months. So it's pretty important to make sure that's, get that on the fridge calendar, get that sorted in plenty of time. And then epididymitis is part of the testicle where the sperm sits and matures. That's probably the most common site for a testicular infection, and we'll go on to a bit of an example of that next slide. And when you get your vet out to do the bull breeding exams, he'll be checking for scrotal hernias and to a certain extent penis problems as well. The thing about the penis problems and libido is they can have, the best sperm in the world, but if they're not able to put it in the cow, don't want to put it in the cow, then it's not going to do any good. And that's why it's still really important to check your bulls are working. The bull breeding exams are the best there is, but they're not perfect. And so, especially when you first put him out, and then keep observing him, checking he's still working, and that he's not developed a problem. And lastly, scrotal circumference is linked to serving capacity, and there are minimum thresholds. It should be 36 centimeters over 2 years old. Most of the breed societies now adhere to, and that will lead to his serving capacity, as I say. So he should be able to get 45 cows in calf once he's a mature bull in a 9-week period. The other thing is scrotal circumference is related to the fertility of his daughters, the Australian work has shown. So in some ways, the bigger, the better there, the more fertile our daughters. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the bull breeding examination done by the vet, I think, is an absolutely vital cornerstone, really, and it just should be done to all bulls that are used for breeding. The reason being, 25% of bulls, and this has been repeated in a number of studies, as well as in the practice I used to work for, are subfertile. And I don't mean infertile, I mean subfertile, which means they will get cows in calf, but you'll have more empty cows or more late calving cows, because they'll not be able to hit, they'll not be able to get 65% conception per service. So it's not a huge deal. You use this probe, feel the testicles first, and gather a semen sample. Now, the semen sample on the right there is a bull that had epididymitis. The farmer was unaware of that, and when I palpated, I felt it. We then took the sample, and you can see those tadpole-like things are the sperm, and then the bright white, the big bright white things in there are actually white cells, and that's produced in the epididymitis, and basically that's pus. So bulls with epididymitis are injecting pus into your cow's uteruses, and clearly that doesn't have a good effect on the fertility. And as I say, it's probably one of the most common causes of scrotal infections. So really, unless you get your vet out, you're not going to know that. I would do it at least a couple of months before the bull goes to work. If it's too close in, there's not enough time. If you need to do a retest, if you need to get him built up condition-wise, you're just running out of time. If you do it too far away, then things can go wrong in the meantime. So a lot of farms, 2 months, 10 weeks before bulling time, get the vaccinations. Once he's passed his semen test, get his bolus in at the same time, do his feet, and that's a good sort of thing to do. Next slide, please, Catherine. So there's the bull there. He's using that electroejaculator, getting erection, and you can see it. It's not a massive deal, really. Next slide, please, Catherine. So then we're into the cow fertility infestations. So BVD, absolutely every cattle farmer with breeding cows needs to know their BVD status. And ideally be a member, if you're in England, of BVD Free England, so your neighbours can find out your BVD status as well. If you're not free, then you need to go PI hunting and eradicating the disease. And if you are free, you need to try and protect that. And I would say as insurance is to vaccinate to stop you going down. Because if you're a naive herd and you get it in, it's a real problem. Not just for you, but potentially even for your neighbours as well. So that's absolutely, it should be done. Leptospira, a bacterial infection that causes barren cows and abortions. Bacteria that travels down watercourses. Need to know your status for that. It's relatively simple to test for with blood tests. If you are clear, you want to try and avoid bringing it in, but also as it travels down watercourses, if you're not the top of the hill and you've got a burn that flows down and the farmer above you is questionable status or buys in cattle from here, there and everywhere, then it may be that you want to start vaccinating. It's not very expensive as an insurance, so you don't get it in. IBR is a condition I used to think was much more prominent in dairy herds for fertility, but I think there are some beef herds that have problems. So it'd be a good idea, again, with blood testing, you can check your status fairly simply. The endometritis or the whites we've already talked about. Hopefully you've dealt with the vast majority of those through targeted checking of your cows 3 weeks after calving. And Campylobacter is a bacterial infection that's a real problem. It's massively underdiagnosed. It's a venereal disease. It lives in the bull's penis, and as he goes serving the cows, he spreads it from cow to cow. It's quite tricky to test for and quite expensive, but if you've got it, it's a real handbrake to your fertility. You can have 20% empty, no worries. It causes reabsorptions, barren cows, abortions. But because of that, it's one of the real reasons why I don't want to buy in non-virgin animals. If you buy in ones that have been naturally mated, either bulls or cows, pregnant cows, or cows with calves at foot, then there's a chance they could be carriers for the Campylobacter. And hired bulls obviously are quite high risk as well for the same reasons. Clearly, if you've got TB, rampant TB, that's going to affect your cow's fertility, much like any other disease. And most people in England should know their TB status and try and source replacements if they are buying in from low risk ones. And lastly, the parasites, chronic liver fluke especially, can really hamper your fertility by reducing the condition score of the cows. So make sure your treatment strategy is using the right product at the right time. It's quite good this time of year, late winter. Take a half dozen dung samples, get your vet to pull them and send off. And there shouldn't be any fluke eggs, but if there are, it's worth checking. It's a way of checking that your housing dose or midwinter dose was effective and you haven't got resistant issues. Right. So next slide, please, Catherine. So in summary, you need to get your cows at their target body condition score for calving, and that's 2.5 to 3, and ideally do that before actually the point of calving, so feed to condition. During the bulling period, cows don't want to be on a negative nutritional plane and ideally rising, and don't just sort of hope for the best. If you think there's issues with feed supply, you can have all the trace elements and vaccinations in the world, but if the cows aren't getting fed enough and they're losing weight, you won't get good fertility. So supplement if necessary. You need to monitor your disease status, know your disease status, and reduce the impact either by eradicating the disease or by vaccinations. And that's as much for your sake as well as your neighbours, really. And those cows that retain the cleansings, had difficult calvings, or had twins, had milk fever, I would target those and check those 3 weeks after calving and check to see if they're clean and don't have any sign of endometritis. And if they have, get your vet to give them a washout. Your heifer selection is pretty important, and it's what age you want to be calving at, and I would suggest calving at 2. It's more efficient, but you have to have high levels of management to make it work. They need to be the right size for bulling, right temperament, pelvic area. Make sure you're not bullying any with small pelvises, and think about their maternal EBVs as well. Bulls are obviously half the thing, 1 in 4 subfertile, and I think it's imperative that you get your vet to check your bull at least a couple of months before he goes to work, to check that he's fully fertile, and maybe give his feet a little trim and get his boluses and his vaccinations in place. And trace element status, you need to know that, and supplement if necessary, and check whatever you're doing is working. Great, so that's me finished.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. Whilst I'm just waiting for some questions to come in, I'd just like to remind you all that the presentation is being recorded and will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels along with our other previous webinars if you want to revisit it. We also have a number of resources on the website relating to health and fertility, including a specific manual on suckler fertility, which is available online, or you can email brp@ahdb.org.uk if you'd like to receive a hard copy. So, Joe, the first question I've had is, what do you class as a tight calving period?
I think really you want to be aiming for some 9 to 10 weeks, possibly just bullying your heifers for 6 weeks. The advantage of just bullying your heifers for 6 weeks is it's only the good breeders that get in calf, and so you get into sort of the opposite to a vicious cycle. It sort of is self-perpetuating good because they have more fertile daughters that you end up bullying. They're born at the start of the calving period. So I think 9 to 10 weeks for the cows and 6 weeks for your heifers is good.
Okay, lovely, thank you. What's your opinion on cows being 4 to 4.5 body condition score at calving, and what problems do you see on getting them back in calf?
Well, yeah, if they're too fat, then fatness switches off fertility. So they're much more at risk of things like milk fever at the point of calving. As I said in the presentation, actual too fat and cows, there's not a lot of evidence. There's both ways to say they'll actually have more calving difficulties, but they are definitely more prone to things like milk fever, which then has an impact of when they come bulling. So if they are too fat, that mid-pregnancy stage, that's when they need to go to Weight Watchers and be reduced, ideally, and get them down. Having said that, I would probably rather them too fat than too lean, because if they're too lean, you really do. There's Irish work showing that each body condition score is worth about 25 days in terms of coming back in calf. So if they're down at condition score 1, the calving interval is something like 440 days. So if they have to be one or the other, it'd be better to be too fit, but that's why it's so important to feed to condition and try and get them at target.
Okay, and I think you did mention a number earlier, but how many cows per bull should you be running, and in particular, if so, not with a mature bull, for a younger bull, how many cows should he be serving?
Right, for young bulls, I often use the rule of thumb that it's however old he is in months is how many cows he can cope with in a bulling period. As I say, I think sort of nine weeks is probably plenty, and so if you've got a 20-month-old bull, I wouldn't give him any more than 20 cows. 24 months, maybe 24, and it wouldn't be till his next year that I'd give him a proper number, and by that I mean anything up to 50 for a fully fertile mature bull. Difficulty with some young bulls is they'll actually end up serving a cow more than once, so they end up using up their bullets too quickly, if they serve a cow 2 and 3 times, whereas generally by the time they've had a bulling season under their belt and they're more mature, they've sort of learned that that's not a good thing. But in terms of, if you look at your cost per calf of the bull, you really want him to be leaving ideally 40 calves a year, and it depends on the nutrition and the field size and et cetera, and how far I have to walk. But
Okay. How variable are trace elements in cows throughout the year? So how many times a year should we test to know our status?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would check them. It's difficult because often the winter ration is different to the summer ration. So for cows that are being bulled in the summertime, you want to get samples in the summertime, because, for instance, if they're on a total miss ration in the winter and getting the mineral every day through the feeder, and you sample them in February pre-calving, then everything could be tickety-boo, and it will be for calving. But then if they go out to grass and there's not an effective way of supplementing them, then it could be they're deficient. So I think it's worth taking samples when they're at grass and also pre-calving. Once you've got a good picture of what's going up on the farm, I don't think you need to do it every single year. but if anything changes, like you Lyme or something like that, and certainly every 3 years it's worth checking. But the important thing is that you know what your status is, and whether how you're fixing that is working.
Okay. To check trace element status, presumably we use blood tests. What proportion of the herd needs to be sampled, and what are approximate costs like for this?
Yeah, so for the blood test, I would always want to do sort of half a dozen to 10 maybe, as a so it's not really so much a percentage, it's sort of minimum numbers from a statistical point of view to get a meaningful result. I don't think it's much point just doing 4, even if you've only got 30 cows, because it might be by chance you pick the ones that go to the mineral tub. It is mostly by blood test. There are some issues that testing copper through a blood test isn't perfect, because what you're doing is you're testing what's going into the animal, not the store in the liver. And liver biopsying is more accurate, but obviously it's more invasive as well. And some, it's a skill that vets need to learn how to do liver biopsying. But certainly if you want to get detail, that's a good way. But you can get an idea through doing blood tests throughout the year. So yeah, I would bleed 6 to 10 depending on how big the herd is, and don't just pick. You try and get representative, so get sort of a couple of younger cows, a couple of medium cows, a couple of older ones, for instance.
Okay. Is the semen test a definitive pass or fail, or can you sometimes get an inconclusive result?
Yeah, that's excellent. So yeah, it very much so. There's few guarantees in life, and equally, it's not always black and white. So you can, because of this issue with subfertile bulls, we tend to, in terms of the actual semen wave motion and progressive motility, tend to score them out of 5, where 3 is a pass, 4 is good, and 5 is sort of flying colours. And if you have your bull stud checked and you've got a couple of 5s and a 3, say, then I would probably put more cows to the 5s and less to the 3, if that makes sense. Equally, so I would never kill a bull on one bad semen test. I would always go and recheck him, and you might have to recheck him up to 2 months later, but I'd probably recheck him after a month. And if he's inconclusive again, check him again, because it can, if he's had a temperature or he's been overworked, then it can take that long for his semen count to recover and get back. So yeah, it needs to, and the vets that are doing this have had the training that in the looking at the results, but also the communication with the farmer. It would be great to always say, this is this means this, but it's a guide, and it's the best guide there is. But yeah, it's sometimes shades of grey.
Okay. What would you say is better, natural insemination or artificial?
It depends what you mean by better. Yeah, they both have their place, but they're sort of different. Obviously, artificial gives you, worldwide genetics, which is brilliant in terms of being able to get short gestation, easy calving, that still grow well. But clearly, you've got to have good handling facilities and have the time to spend on the labour. Equally, if the AI technician goes lame, he still inseminates your cows, whereas if a bull goes lame, he sometimes doesn't. So I think we'll probably over rely on bulls, and I think most herds would benefit from doing a bit of both. And the massive advantage of synchronizing is that you can get 2/3 of your cows conceiving on day 1 of your bulling period, so that will really lift your average weaning weight. And I think now there's 3 handling things for synchronizing, especially for heifers. I think there's real, heifers should be, there's a lot of, it should be good. But bulls are equally good, but they are surprisingly, they're fallible. They're, they can go lame. They're fine all year. You put them out, they go lame. They go fighting with another bull. They knock the fence down. They're not just as, although they can be easy, you know, they have big depreciation figures. Where do you keep them the other 9 months of the year? You know, yeah. So difficult to say which is better. I think every farm's different. You need to have a chat with your vet and see what's your breeding goals are, where you want to be, and fit it to that.
Yeah. Should cows have a stable diet for a length of time before the bulling period? So is there a minimum amount of time that they should be at grass before the bull goes in?
Not so much. I mean, yeah, I don't think it's worth any change in ration, even if it is, for instance, for the better, can upset ruminants. So I think if you want to be bulling, they need to be settled for a couple of weeks before you put the bull in. On the change of ration, I wouldn't want to change them, you know, the day you put them in or halfway through, because even a change for the better is a stressor, and it can be. So yeah, I would think at least a fortnight, and preferably longer.
Okay.
I mean, having said that, if for instance you think the grass is getting shorter and shorter, if there's a drought on and things, I think you have to, as I said, you've got to try and start supplementing. Don't leave it till late, till the cows have got thin. You know, act now.
Okay. How should you prepare your bull for work in terms of exercise?
Well, that's a good one. I think ideally, I think what's been done on some farms really good is make electric fence laneways. So rather than just having the bull in a tiny little box, you know, 10 foot by 10 foot, and then be like me going straight from my life to then trying to run the Great North Run, you know, I wouldn't be able to do it. You'd need to do a bit of training first. So the more exercise, the better. Clearly, that's difficult, but electric fence a field, a dry field, and let them walk around in that. If you've got multiple bulls, I never keep them in more than pairs. If pair will go head to head and have a little scrap, but it's when they're doing that, if you've got 3 bulls and the third comes in from the side, that's when you tend to get stifles put out or legs broken and things. So if you've got quite a few bulls and a sandy field somewhere, you can split the field up with electric fence into laneways, sort of 5 yards wide, and they can sort of walk up and down, water trough at one end, feed at the other, and that gets them sort of used to walking and stretching out. Because, as I say, I think it's a real problem that bulls are kept shut in a box and then put onto a 300-acre hill and expected to keep up with the cows, and they end up losing a lot of weight. And you know, it's not their fault really, but the PDs then aren't up to scratch.
Okay, thank you. How accurate are the easy calving scores on AI information?
So some of the AI bulls are really accurate because they've got thousands of calves on the, you know, the older ones especially, and they generally, the older the bull, the more accurate the AI, because they actually have offspring. So some of them are really accurate. I would always go for actual EBVs rather. Some of the AI companies make up their own in-house sort of values. They're not EBVs. That's very much all based on dairy cows. You know, putting liveys on dairies or Herefords on dairies or whatever. I would actually stick to proper EBVs, and they are there, as I say, every registered bull. So if you get his name or his tag number and say he's an Angus bull, you go onto the Angus website and you'll have his EBVs there. And the older he is, which or the more calves he has, the more accurate that is. So often the AI accuracies are really great, and sometimes into the 90s, you know, because they've not only just measured like his cousins and uncles and stuff like that. He might have lots of offspring on the ground himself.
Okay. The heifers always take longer to return to heat in comparison with the cows, which impacts on our calving period. Do you have any suggestions on how we can manage this in the herd?
Yeah, so that it is tricky, and everyone has that problem getting those first calvers back in calf. So there's a couple of things. What some people do is try and calve the heifers a bit before the main herd. I think that's tricky for ones that are calving at 2, because basically you're trying to get them to calve at 23 months, so you're bulling at 14 months. You're just pushing it a bit hard. I personally think a better way is to just bull your heifers for 6 weeks, because they're all then have to calve in the first sort of half of your calving or 2/3 of your calving period. So that in effect gives them extra time to get back in calf. Yeah, I think that's probably the better way of doing it. If you're calving at 2.5 or 3, then yeah, calving them a month before the cows, and you can really concentrate on them, works well. But there's not, some farms obviously can't do that.
Okay, thank you.
Making sure they're on the best, not getting bullied as well. Don't carve them and stick them in with the cows, because they will, cow pecking order. It's called pecking order from, because hens, but actually it's amazing. Cows are really quite nasty, and I would not put them back in with the cows until they've calved for the second time, because the cows will bully them, and that's a stressor. And certainly they'll get, they'll be last to the water trough, last to the good bits of grass, or if there are any supplement and stuff. And so yeah, I would try and manage them as a group, as first calvers. And some people, depending on how big your herd is, will put their heifers and first calvers together as a group, and keep them away from the main herd until they calve for the second time.
Okay. Are there any vaccinations that have any impact on fertility?
Yeah, well, loads. So, if you've got BVD or lepto or IBR, then there's vaccines for them that can sort that out, or certainly reduce their impact. You can make vaccines up for the Campylobacter if you have that diagnosed as well. So yeah, there's sort of those 4 main ones. Ideally, just like the bulls, I wouldn't vaccinate them just before they go. You're going to make them, for the same reason as it's a stressor, and you want all your ducks lined up. You don't want to be giving them something that might give them a temperature when you're trying to get them in calf.
Okay. And do antibiotics have a negative impact on semen?
Occasionally, and some do, but the bigger problem is the fact that often whatever you're treating is likely to have a much bigger impact on the fertility. So there's sort of almost a myth that antibiotics damage fertility, and certainly in sheep, we inject a lot of sheep, for instance, when they're coming onto farms as a quarantine, to try and reduce them bringing on to CUDD or something like that, and it seems to be fine with certain antibiotics. But there are some you need to avoid, and your vet will advise you on that. But as I say, the biggest problem is whatever reason you need to give the bad. So say it's got an infected pussy foot or a touch of pneumonia, then that much more likely to damage the fertility than the antibiotics you're using to treat it. But often the antibiotics end up getting the blame.
Okay, thank you. We use multivitamin injections post-calving. What are your thoughts on these?
Yeah, if necessary. I mean, I sometimes think I see farmers using vitamin E injections, and yeah, green grass is full of vitamin E. So that's unnecessary. But I think if you need them, if you've identified a shortage and you need to use them, then fair enough. A lot of the vitamin injections are pretty short acting though, so then I can't see that they'll have a massive impact. But if you need to and you've proven risk, then yeah, brilliant.
Thank you. And can we over-supplement minerals by giving boluses and licks?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can, which is why it's worth. You need to check to see where you are with what you're doing. And certainly, you can easily poison them with copper, for instance. And so that's why it's not just a question of just chucking boluses down, pulling licks out, pulling a bit of mineral out. And I think, well, for one, it's a waste of money because you might be giving them way too much, and these products aren't cheap. And 2, you might be getting toxicosis. So yeah, selenium, copper, Iodine's been shown to lock up colostrum. Yeah, they all have problems if you give too much. So that's why it's important to identify what you need, give appropriate stuff, and then check to see where you are.
And another question, what percentage of bearing cows would you say is acceptable?
A lot depends on your targets individually with your farm, but where you want to be in terms of you're hitting your straps. But I would think if you've got 5 to 6% empty in a 9-week bulling period, that's okay. However, it might be you're trying to cull hard for fertility, and you're putting loads of heifers in, and you might only be bulling for 7 weeks, and you might have a 10%, and that's okay for your farm. But so I think you need to set those goals with your vet as to what you want to be and your intervention levels here.
Okay, lovely. And then just one more question: which are the most important minerals to consider? Is there anything that you would say more important than others?
Yeah, in terms of the trace elements, is the selenium, the copper, and the iodine, I think, are the most important. As I said, I think the trace elements sometimes get a disproportionate amount of emphasis put on them, and they forget that actually they've got to have enough energy and protein. That's more important. They've actually got enough to eat, or hopefully too much to eat almost. But yeah, the copper, selenium, iodine are the most important, I would say.
Okay, lovely. And I've just had one more question come in. What are the approximate costs of trace element testing?
So very, very roughly, might be £12–14 a test, depending on what you want to test for. But the iodine can be quite expensive, which is why we often pool it and do a pool. But somewhere about that. Yeah, £12–15, possibly a bit more if you're doing iodine as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you to everybody for listening. We've had some great questions there. There's been quite a lot of interest in AI, so I'd just like to remind you all that AHDB are currently part funding do-it-yourself AI courses, which are available all over the country to any producer with 30 or more breeding females. So if that is something that you are interested in, then there's more information available on that on the AHDB website. So have a look on there. Thank you again, everybody. Have a good evening.